Okay. In today's secular society, there is little that is more important to us than success. The world will define success as earning a large annual salary in return for doing their job and from the perfect job, living in a dream home. A successful person is not required to worry about making ends meet because they're wealthy and famous. I want to be a commercial airline pilot. This is a profession that is often portrayed as being a glamorous career in which the pilot is respected and is paid a sizable salary in return for flying a plane. This sounds like the perfect situation to me, but I was not entirely sure it was accurate. From my experience this year, I wanted to find out if this was an accurate representation of a pilot's career and whether success is simply earning a large sum of money or if there's more to what makes a pilot a great pilot. As part of my experience, I had the opportunity to go on a flight in a Cessna 172. Before this, I had never previously been on any plane smaller than a commercial jet, so this was something I had always wanted to have done. It was also necessary for me to know what it's like to fly in a small plane if I wanted to become a pilot. We would fly from Centennial Airport in Highlands Ranch to an airport in Greeley to eat breakfast and then fly back. Before every flight, a pilot needs to go through the pre-flight checklist. This checklist included touching the cold metal control surfaces on the plane because it was a fairly cold morning when we arrived at the airport, and we checked the fuel while inevitably spilling some on our hands in the bitter morning breeze. It was an uncomfortable but necessary step to flying the plane. Once we were finally ready to fly, the pilot radioed the air traffic control tower for permission to taxi to the correct runway. And the way the pilots and controllers talk to each other it sounds like a completely different language that I did not fully understand, but I trusted the pilot and we proceeded to take off. I had been informed that takeoff in a small plane would feel much different than takeoff in an airliner, but I actually found that it was very similar, although that could have been due to having a good pilot. Once we were in the air, the plane was much more maneuverable than I expected, and it was capable of making tight turns and short dives that made it feel like I was on a roller coaster. We approached the airport in Greeley, where there was no control tower, so the pilots were required to radio other planes in the area on the airport's frequency and hope that the other pilots would inform them if they were landing on the same runway as them. Fortunately, everything was clear, and we taxied after landing to park the plane. The planes were parked directly in front of the diner, and many other pilots had also flown to Greeley to eat breakfast together. It was very interesting to me that so many pilots would regularly fly all the way to another city to eat breakfast. Once we were done, we took off from the airport, and I noticed that there was very little civilization around us, and it looked like the airport was only used by pilots eating breakfast at the airport. During the flight back, the flight took about 15 minutes, and the pilot let me control the plane for a few of those minutes. And those few minutes were some of the best minutes I've ever experienced. Even if I didn't get to control the plane all that much, the control I did have over the plane was an incredible sensation and confirmed that this was what I wanted to do for the rest of my life, hopefully. And like I said, the flight only lasted about 15 minutes in each direction, and it did not feel like I had been all the way to Greeley and back in a single morning. The checklists a pilot is required to go through are not only for small planes, but also for large airliners. The list of items is much longer, and each one must be completed before even pulling away from the gate. Many pilots, after hundreds of flights, become bored with their career, even though it's terrifying and exciting to fly an airliner. After hundreds of flights of filling out the exact same paperwork before every takeoff, they're tempted to skip their checklists for the sake of time. Even on my recent short flight, it was tempting to skip this checklist because it felt redundant and almost unnecessary because the plane was in perfect working order and it did not reveal any problems with the aircraft. But this is very far from the truth of flying an airplane. I interviewed the pilot that I ate breakfast with, and one of the questions I asked him was why he thought the checklists were so important if they rarely revealed any important problem. His answer was that if we do not always check everything before every flight, a problem will eventually catch up with us. He's told a story of a rich man that he knew of who had his own private jet, and on his jet the pilots were required to connect the elevators on the tail of the plane to the controls in the cockpit. His pilots felt pressured to rush through their checklists, and they overlooked this crucial step. The plane sped down the runway, and as it reached the speed for takeoff, they could not pull up into the air, and the plane ran full speed off the end of the runway, and everyone was killed in the accident. These pilots were not inept pilots. They were fully capable of operating an aircraft. But they had not taken the time to develop the perseverance it takes to always go through this seemingly unimportant checklist. And as a result, they ended up losing their own lives as well as the lives of those on board their plane. This is why perseverance is one of the most important virtues for any pilot to have. One of the books I read was the autobiography of Captain Sullenberger, who was the pilot who landed his airliner in the middle of the Hudson River. You may have heard of this from the recent movie called Sully. It was an incredible feat of skill that many other pilots who attempted the same scenario in simulators could not successfully complete. In his book, he describes his time as an Air Force pilot, and even though he was never in the danger of an actual war, he flew old fighter jets that were not as safe as they are now. And there were plenty of times when a pilot was forced to eject because of a malfunction with the aircraft itself, or even times when the ejector seat failed to work properly. There were also several events in which the pilot should have ejected but did not. Captain Sullenberger studied these pilots and found from the ones who survived an accident like this that they were more concerned with solving a problem that could not be fixed rather than their own lives or the lives of those on the airplane. And because of his training, he was able to dedicate himself to always knowing when a problem was unsolvable. And in the case of the Hudson River landing, another pilot would have probably attempted to turn back to the airport and land at the runway normally and risk missing the runway. Because he had dedicated himself to always knowing when a problem was unsolvable, he realized that in just a few seconds that he could not make it back to the airport and was forced to make a water landing. Because of this decision, he saved everyone's lives on board the plane, but he was faced with a lot of consequences and questions for not making the seemingly more logical choice of turning back to the airport. Because of this decision and the decision of many other pilots, it is clear that having a higher moral value of valuing the lives of others more than your own reputation, also known as integrity, is another incredibly important virtue that every pilot needs to have. If these virtues are so important, then I needed to know how I could possibly begin developing them. I wanted to know first if anyone could be virtuous in the cockpit but act differently everywhere else. One of my examples came from the movie Flight, in which the pilot had been a drug addict and an alcoholic for most of his life. But he was still able to land his crashing airliner in a way that nearly all of the passengers survived. And no other pilot probably could have made a landing like that. Throughout all of this, he had still been making wrong decisions in his everyday life and was still struggling with drug and alcohol abuse. From this, I realized that even if a pilot can successfully deal with one situation, his non-virtuous side will eventually catch up to him, like it did in the end of the movie. The pilot eventually could not deal with his addictions anymore. He admitted his mistakes in front of a court, was fired from the airline, sent to jail, and was never allowed to fly a plane again. His entire life was ruined because he was not willing to be virtuous anywhere but at his job. A virtue can only be developed if it encompasses every part of a person's life. Captain Sullenberger agrees that a virtue can be developed in this way, but it has to include places where it would also not be obvious. Every little action I take will slowly train my mind to continue acting in that way. Even small things like maybe deciding not to run a red light when it's late at night and I would not be in danger of any accident, or simply completing a homework assignment before I'm required to, will teach me restraint and discipline, which will help me if I'm ever tempted to skip something like a pre-flight checklist. Captain Sullenberger was able to act calmly and appropriately in his horrifying situation because he had practiced things like these in his everyday life. By the time his emergency was upon him, it was almost second nature for him to quickly go through all of his options and make the correct decision. If a person does not develop a virtue before disaster strikes, it might not be there for him when he needs it most. My next goal was to discover what exactly it's like to be an airline pilot. I read a book called Squawk 7700 by Peter Buffington, which documents his experiences from going from being a child with the dream of becoming an airline pilot to making it a reality. When the first time he flew a small plane, it was almost a dream come true for him, a lot like it was for me. Once he began his training as a private pilot, he was incredibly careful to follow every regulation that was required by his instructor. And he made this a priority over getting into the air quickly. He carried this idea into his training as a commercial pilot, which is when he first realized that many pilots were willing to overlook this dedication to regulations in favor of paying their way through flight school and being placed into an airline as a first officer with very little flight time. Buffington became frustrated that pilots would be hired by an airline based solely off of their titles that they held, rather than their willingness to follow regulations, and their ability to deal with emergencies. Despite all this, he continued on with his career and went from company to company, delivering cargo in small planes at night, being paid next to nothing, and each company would pressure him more and more to reject the rules in favor of making them more money. He finally ended up at a large regional airline flying passengers, and it felt as if his flying career was finally looking brighter, until he was faced with the exact same problems that he thought he had left behind. After several months of dealing with constant maintenance issues that other pilots were willing to overlook, irresponsibility as a whole, causing danger to the crew and the passengers, he realized that he could not continue on in this field. He was frustrated with being reprimanded for reporting problems with the aircraft and the complete lack of care for safety from the airline itself. Although the Federal Aviation Administration, or the FAA, has made several changes, such as requiring much more flight time to be considered to be hired by an airline, the events in this book took place only a little over 10 years ago, and those same pilots are still flying today as irresponsible as ever. This makes me hope that I am not forced out of a career that I love, like Peter Buffington was, and that I can continue on standing up for what I believe, no matter what might face me. I can only imagine what my life might look like outside of school. I am actually very similar to Peter Buffington in my interests and what his job was once he quit his airline career. He ended up working at a computer company developing software, and computers have also always been a major interest of mine, and there's a good chance that I could end up in the same position as Buffington did if I cannot continue on with flying. Even if I am forced out of pursuing my dream, what I want more is to know that I am able to stand up for what I believe, no matter what might happen to me. I've never been truly tested in this way, and I am not sure if I would be able to completely follow through. Coincidentally, it turns out that Peter Buffington was friends with Jeff Skiles, who was the co-pilot to Captain Sullenberger during the Hudson River landing. After their emergency landing, Skiles realized the same things that Peter Buffington did about the increasingly lax safety regulations that were common among airlines at that time. He did not want an inexperienced pilot to be placed into the same position he was without the proper training and discipline. He was a major influence on the FAA's choice to increase flight training requirements and to improve pilots' behavior. I want to also be capable of not stopping at solving my own problems, but also seeing what others need and trying to prevent them from experiencing the same issues that I might face. What I want most, though, is to be able to do this, but also be able to continue pursuing my career while standing up for what I believe. I hope that each of you, whether you are still in school and you are not quite sure what you want to do with your life yet, or you are already in the middle of your career, that you will always look for ways to improve. And no matter what might happen to your salary or your lifestyle, and that you will realize the effects that your actions have on the rest of your life. I hope that I can continue to always uphold my own values no matter what consequences might face me, and that I can continue pursuing my dream throughout the rest of my life.
Do we have any questions for Jacob?
Yep.
When you went on that flight, were you with Mr. Butler?
When I went on that flight, yes, I was with Mr. Butler. He was just a passenger, but yeah.
When did you realize you wanted to become a pilot?
I guess I've always had an interest in flying planes, but I guess when I first flew on a flight simulator on a computer and realized that you could do that for a living, I saw an ad for San Diego Christian University, and they have a flight program. So.
So when you want to, I guess, does it take like a lot of years of training to be a pilot? And you're going to like major in aviation, right? Or,
Yeah.
Yeah. So then afterwards, do you have like training you have to do? Or?
Yes. After college, I would graduate with my commercial license, and then to get your airline transport license, if you come out of college, you need 1,000 hours of flight time to get it, to be hired by an airline.
What airline are you hoping to fly for?
I'm not sure what airline I want to fly for, actually. I haven't looked that far ahead yet.
How do you feel you're doing on developing those two virtues that you identified as being critical for being a pilot?
I think I'm doing okay on developing them. I mean, I'm trying not to procrastinate too much on assignments as much as I used to. And I mean, I never actually ran a red light at night, just so you know. But little things like that, I'm trying to be more aware of when what I should do.
Do we have any other final questions? Can we give Jacob another round of applause? Thank you very much. You are all excused to go to your next session.